as we begin this conversation, a form of sex, the protocol or the process is one of sympathy, antipathy, and synthesis. In other words, we let in what is, we react to what is with antipathy, with differentiation. And then between the shape that we are and the shape of the other, we synergize and synthesize to ideally take the best in the other and retain the best in ourselves. And best in this case is that which facilitates grace, facilitates sustainable human well-being. My first exposure to Mo was on a diary of a CEO. And in that, I recognized a couple of things. The first was the engineering approach to happiness, which I sympathize with, meaning there is so much confusion, there's so much contradictory data out there on what happiness is and how to pursue it. So much of it is out of sync with personal experience, and so I sympathize with the goal to have an engineering approach to happiness. I also empathize deeply with Mo's journey around the death of his son. And the higher the quality of the relationship, the deeper the loss. You know, it's not a big deal to lose a mediocre, miserable, sociopathic, unproductive relationship. In some cases, in the death of a sociopathic, abusive parent, there's a sense of relief. There's a sense of, okay, I'm never going to have to figure out how to respond to the next manipulation again. I'm free. Right? So it's not a difficult death. But in Mo's case, the death of, someone who loves him, the death of a friend, the death of a teacher, right? That is a very big death. And so the loss, it's a very big loss. So the death is potentially incredibly painful. And the response to that death is also, I think, incredibly rare. People lose loved ones all the time, and perhaps 2% of those people set out to do something to honor the death of the loved one. And so, that's, I would say, turning the loved one into the beloved, into the divine, to honor and serve what's best in oneself, what's best in humanity, in response to what's best in the other. So 2% of human beings go about that in a conscious way. But Mo's gone about that, made that service, that devotion to what's beautiful and true in himself, in his son, in humanity, made that his highest priority. And here we're talking less than 1% of the population. We're talking about maybe 1% of 1%. And in pursuit of a transcendent joy, meaning the sense of joy that is beyond the chatter of the mind or the state of being in reality, we're definitely up in that 1% of 1% territory. Because statistically, in our culture, less than 1% of the population, less than 1% of the time, is in a transcendent state of acceptance. This is what is. This is a state of joy and love of what is. My biggest empathy for Mo is being in the isolation when he talked about the difficulty in finding a date, the exquisitely high standard of a woman, a wife, who is loved and who loves him, and yet does not choose that path to honor the divine in humanity with Mo, in the Son with Mo. Right? That's a very painful place for me to imagine, and so I have a lot of empathy. And I notice that I feel almost a certain type of shame, as in understanding that such a vulnerable place of service deserves to be held, deserves to be honored highly. And because I have not found the ability, the willingness to do that in myself for the highest expressions of humanity, I cannot fully look Mo in the eye and be with him in both the celebration and the grief in that territory. And so I almost wish that Mo did not bring that to the cultural ecology, because one of my greatest pains is the part of that in others, the part of that in me, that's like crocuses in the snow beginning to pierce through in the spring. And something so beautiful, something so fragile, to be surrounded by something so cold, so unresponsive. In my understanding, we have 4 brains and 4 operating systems: the reptilian brain, the rational brain, the human or empathic brain, and the transcendent brain. And the rational and the reptilian brain, which is where most of us are most of the time, the rational reptile, functioning with a sense of enlightened self-interest, with all of the fears and jealousies and hurts and pains and frustrations and rages and irritations and self-centeredness. The rational reptile, the rational sociopath that still understands that one must be polite and do this because that's the way things are done, but it's not coming out of a deep place of empathy. It's not human much of the time. And so in that sense, my most painful experiences in life are when I'm a human being and I'm bringing forth empathy meaning I'm coming from my empathic brain and operating system, and I'm surrounded by rational reptiles that aren't feeling it, that aren't responding. And this is so lonely. This is so painful that I usually retreat into my own rational reptile through judgment and analysis to criticize the lack of competence, the lack of empathy, the lack of psychological skill in those who cannot respond to empathy, right? And it's more comforting to be in that judgment, that rational reptile, because a reptile is cold-blooded, meaning a reptile does not feel hurt. It may have a sense of righteous rage, but a reptile has no feeling of empathy, hurt, or pain. It's just instinctual, right? So I deeply appreciate Mo's journey into this territory. And it's a vital territory, a map of well-being, a map that can take people closer towards happiness and well-being. And I deeply believe that the structure, the map that Mo is and has been creating is more effective than not. Meaning, you can have a lot of streets on a map that aren't there, and you can have a lot of streets that are there that are not on the map, and you can still go in the general direction. A map is never perfect. Even the best Google map up to date, etc., does not show you how many pine cones you passed on the latest tree. Now that's irrelevant to going where you need to go, but it nonetheless brings into awareness the fact that no map is complete, that the map is not the reality. It is suggestive of elements of the reality. And so the value of a map is in how accurately, how reliably it takes you in the direction of sustainable well-being. Even if it's all lies, if most people, most of the time following that map, end up in a higher state of well-being, then it's a useful lie. And it is important to understand the foundation of language. The ultimate map of reality is dividing the one into 60,000 words. But of course, the one is vastly more complex than the 60,000 words would suggest. And many of the words are poorly defined. And many of the words create more of a sense of separation from the things adjacent to them than they do insight of the interconnectivity of all things. We call this thing a finger, but the finger creates an illusion of separation. First of all, the finger isn't a finger, it's a sound that symbolizes letters. And the letters are not a finger. They are shapes that symbolize a picture, that are a symbol for a picture. And the picture of a finger isn't the finger. Right? We can say that this is a finger, but it isn't. Right? The very idea of the finger is flawed because it doesn't exist without the hand. the hand doesn't exist without the arm, etc. The finger cannot be a finger without the heart and the blood. The word separates the finger from the rest of the ecology in the illusion created in our minds. But it's not real. And so, of course, I'm using words that are all illusions. Mo's using words that are all illusions. The illusions aren't real, but they can take us closer to a sense of well-being that is real. They can point. The words are signposts that can point you towards the town. The words are not the town, but they can get you in that general direction. So my focus here is, first of all, to take the best of what I can learn from Mo, because there's another thing that I think is an important distinction. I recognize that Mo is more talented and thus more successful than I in arriving at transcendent joy. Transcendent means it's not a joy based on this going the way I wanted it and that going the way I wanted it and that going the way I wanted it. And it's all perfect. And so, any fool can feel joy when the world conforms to their preferences. It's completely natural. One requires zero talent. If anyone touches your body in the perfect way you like to be touched, you will feel pleasure. And when most of what's going on mentally, emotionally, physically is consistent with your preferences, well, feeling joy, feeling happiness is the easiest thing in the world, the most natural thing in the world, and requires zero skill. On the other hand, when you lose the most precious thing in your life, when possibilities are routinely killed that you find beautiful, when your physical body is in enormous pain and the people around you are making it worse in many ways, then to find, to locate, to feel, and come back to transcendent joy is an expression of mastery, an expression of talent, of discipline, of practice. Anyone can run, but some people can run a marathon and come out energized. Some people can run a marathon and be dead beat for 6 weeks afterwards. Some people can not run a marathon, and some people can't run a few steps, right? And so we can all move if we have limbs, etc., but there's a range in skill. And my impression is that Mo is a more talented runner by hundreds of % than I am. And that the model, the map that he's constructed with words to use as his guide as he runs is excellent in some areas, is fuzzy and not as robust as it could be in other areas. But that even when refined, it is useful to understand that it's all words, meaning that all words are lies. They're just models. They're not reality. So in navigating this masterpiece of exploration and growth, the question is where to be sympathetic in terms of download that as the language, and where to have antipathy, to reject. and iterate. And so let's begin with the setting up the equation, because the definition of words is really crucial.
Setting up the equation. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, tall or short, male or female, young or old. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you do for a living, what language you speak, or what tragedies you've endured. Wherever you are, whoever you are, you want to be happy. It's a human desire, about as basic as the drive to take the next breath.
Now, I would say that is a really good general assumption, but it is interesting in that framework how hard so many people work to be miserable. To give you an example, I had separated from what had been a pretty traumatic and painful household. Both of my parents were in enormous amounts of pain. They caused each other enormous amounts of pain, and they brought that pain to the children. And I remember at age 12, first of all, hacking the code, because my parents elicited delinquent behavior, traumatic behavior out of each of their children in different ways. And I was the only person that would successfully babysit my 4 younger siblings when I was 12, 13, 14, 15. And so they were kind of stuck having to work with me because the other babysitters didn't want to deal with that amount of dysfunction and chaos. And I also didn't want to deal with that amount of dysfunction and chaos. And so I had to understand what it was that my parents were doing to elicit the dysfunctional behavior in my siblings. And then I had to do it differently so that I didn't elicit that dysfunctional behavior, but actually allowed their authentic, natural, happy selves to come out. And I figured the code out, and it would take about 30 minutes for the adrenaline to settle down after my parents left the house. And then I would behave differently than my parents. My siblings would be very happy. They tested me initially and went through all their different tantrums, and then they settled back, after the first few testing periods and seeing that the tantrums didn't get them what they needed, and that just being themselves gave them all that they needed. And so then they would become happy again. And I sat my father down because my mother was somewhat delusional, but my father was quite smart. And both of them were into personal growth and metaphysics and, hippie type values, so kind of moving towards happiness in their own minds. And so I sat my father down and I said, this is how you and mom create dysfunction, terror, delinquency in the house and in the family. And this is what I do when you go to help them be more of who they actually are. And they cannot sustain more than about 5 minutes of who they are once you return to the house, and then they become delinquent again. Now, to someone who is bright, articulate, well-versed in psychology and metaphysics, and espousing, a variety of different ideals, this would be the most exciting news you've ever heard. Your children are not dysfunctional, and you don't have to have a dysfunctional house. And in fact, there is a way to spend less energy than you're spending to have happy, healthy family dynamics rather than traumatic, dysfunctional ones. Well, my father was absolutely uncomfortable and miserable. He looked all around. He stared into space. He opened his eyes, and it was absolutely clear that this was the last thing that he wanted to hear. And yet it is the most vital thing, meaning in not hearing that, in refusing to block that out, what he's saying, in a sense, is I would willingly destroy the well-being of myself, my wife, and all of my children, rather than learn and shift this dynamic, which is being handed to me by my eldest son, who has the ability to shift the dynamic in less than 30 minutes per occasion, with less of the authority that a parent has. So this is the most wonderful ball. This wonderful golden ball is being offered, and it's being blocked, right? And so Mo is saying that we all want to be happy, but the data suggests that whether it's parents or ourselves or our government or our clients or our children, that there's a tremendous commitment to being unhappy. And it's important in a model to understand why. We all want to be happy, so why are we so loyal to that which makes us unhappy? And why do we fight off that which could bring happiness and joy? Because if we don't acknowledge the huge disparity between the passionate behavior that sustains our misery, that we hang on to with dear life, and the drive to be happy, if we don't understand how that's both of those phenomena are true, we lack a complete model. And so far, in this opening, we don't have data from Mo about that model. Now, what I would suggest as the connecting point between these seemingly diverse things, we have the deep commitment to negativity over here. We have our innate drive for happiness over here. So what connects these two? What makes the pursuit of misery an indirect pursuit of happiness would be another way of saying that. And what I would say is that we need certainty before we can iterate. I would say that the primary need of an I, of an ego, is for stability, for certainty, for predictability. And the secondary need is for pleasure, is for well-being. In other words, and you'll see this a lot in teenagers, you will find that a child born into an abusive home, and most of our homes are abusive to one degree or another. It's just, if you define abuse as the absence of excellent use, then nobody's optimal in that territory. Relative, we can be in the top 1%, but the top 1% today is going to be in the bottom 1% at a certain future stage in evolution. Right? We're all, the bottom 1% on the planet today is ahead of the top 1% of cave people. Right? The bottom 1% in many cases have televisions, right? Something that wasn't even invented in the time of the cave human. So in that iterative process, the top percentage becomes the bottom percentage over time, right? The first person to get a landline becomes the last person to have a landline when everyone else has gone wireless, right? And so there is that movement, and it's that, that's useful to understand. But you cannot evolve. Animals, for example, have a phenomena called learned helplessness. And if they cannot figure out the pattern that correlates between their behavior and their misery or happiness, they lay on the floor and do nothing. Right? Learned helplessness. It's a collapse of hope, a collapse of trying to figure out. It's just basically, this is induced by erratic electric shocks that are not particularly fatal or anything, but no one likes to be shocked. And so if you send out a random electric shock, the animal will first go through a system of trying jumping, trying this, trying that, trying barking, trying silence. They'll try the whole range in their probability field. And if nothing affects the shock, they just lay there and get shocked and stop doing anything. If they can find a behavior that corresponds with an improvement, then they start doing something. But if you if you open the cage, for example, if you open the cage for a dog that has learned helplessness, they will not walk out. They have gone through a certain number of loops in making an effort to escape the pain, to escape the shock. And none of them have worked, and their conclusion is that conserving all energy is superior to hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment, which costs energy. And so they won't get out. And the elephant learns this with the rope, right? The baby elephant can't break the rope, gets their leg all bloody trying to escape. The older elephant doesn't try. It's a learned helplessness. So that's one thing. We have all learned helplessness. We have all tried thousands of times to mitigate the unbearable grief, the unbearable trauma in certain areas of our cult, of our culture. And we're not interested in being invoked into hope in that area because it takes energy and it's painful. So that's one thing to understand, why there is an active resistance to doorways and paths to happiness, even if they work, having tried many things that do not work. So that's one thing to understand, that you will meet learned helplessness in yourself and in others. I don't want to try another diet. I don't want to try another relationship. I don't want to hear the bullshit about how it could be so much better, that it's better to try and fail, and all that bullshit. I just want to stay where I am and conserve energy. Spend as little energy as possible. Even though where I am is painful, but it is predictable. It's painful, it's predictable. So that's one thing. The other thing to understand is that there is a deep drive in human beings to have agency, to have control. Now, Mo, of course, understands that deeply. It takes an enormous amount of self-discipline and control to become head of Google X or run any company. It's a process of controlling and disciplining and seeing that certain things happen. And there is a drive in every human being to become independent of the painful effects of other people. Now, and in doing so, find certainty. Because if you watch, for example, in many sociopathic families and dynamics, you will find that there'll be a happy child, happily playing with themselves, and they're kind of going up to joy, right? And most teenagers are not capable of creating that state in themselves. So there's jealousy, there's envy, there's frustration, there's rage, but there's also a deep sense of powerlessness in most teenagers in our culture. And so the teenager will knock the kid down into misery. Bullying, teasing, humiliation, taking their toys, hitting them. Happens constantly if you pay attention to any playground, any family. There is this sociopathic, I can't create the joy myself, but I'm going to pull you down, right? So that goes on. And in many cases, the child will bounce for a while, and in a childlike, they'll go up to joy and happiness. The teenager will knock them down to misery and helplessness. They'll go up to joy and happiness. The teenager will knock them down. Maybe the parent is doing this. A frustrated, helpless father. My father took enormous satisfaction in tormenting the entire family unit. And the closer you got to him, the more he would torment you. And so if you had any well-being at all, that was the target, to torment that and take it down. Now, is he feeling happy destroying his children's happiness? Yes, he is, right? So we need a more complex model. Everyone is pursuing happiness. But if you are miserable and you cannot escape the misery, and everything that you've tried to not be miserable has led to a sense of helplessness and humiliation, then your happiness becomes destroying other people's misery and feeling less alone and less ashamed of being the only one that can't get out of prison, so to speak. So there is a way where the drive to be happy for the abuser becomes the drive to make other people unhappy. And that's important to understand. So we have learned helplessness. Then we have happiness in pulling someone down to our level so that we're not alone there. That's the second happiness that is suffering. And the third form of happiness that is suffering is keeping myself miserable, right? Meaning, if you watch this child who's gone into a joyful, innocent state, then they're burst into tears, joyful, innocent state, burst into tears. And at some point, the child, as they mature, recognizes that what the enjoyment of their tormentor is knocking them down. So that's the first recognition in the victim. The enjoyment of my abuser is knocking me down. That's where the pleasure for them is. And they can't, so then the second realization is that they can't knock me down if I'm already down. The third awareness is I, as a small person, as an infant, as a child, who is bullied by a parent, by a cult that is bigger than me, I cannot maintain a joyful state when someone can take my food away, when someone can beat me into a traumatized state. Now, the traumatized state is the reptilian state, right? We all have the four brains. The reptilian state is fight, flight, freeze, and please, or ask-lick, in an effort to survive. This is the reptilian state. And so the reptilian state is induced when we are repeatedly traumatized by a larger pattern of energy, a parent, an older sibling, that we depend on. Meaning a child and adolescent cannot leave home and meet their own human needs. They're in a dependent relationship. They can't leave. An incompetent spouse with no money and survival skills cannot leave. They're in a childlike relationship with their spouse. Very common. Traditionally, statistically, it's a female. Because traditionally, statistically, the female creates babies and is attached to those babies living, and the male creates money, food, shelter, etc., that provides for the female's life and the baby's life. So in that traditional dynamic, the more babies the female has, and the more attached she is to them surviving, in a helpless state where she's not learning about business, she's not learning about law, she's not learning about money, she doesn't have her own time or her own money and skills and options. She's in a dependent relationship. And so all the male has to do is threaten her or the children, or her and the children's survival. And she will move into fight, flight, freeze, or please. And so the bullying dynamic is often about inducing the please effect. A reptile, a snake, cannot please their offender. But a human with a reptile and a pattern analyzing brain knows that if they give a good enough blowjob, for example, that they won't be beaten that night, right? So what's it going to be? Beating or narcissistic pleasing, right? And so there's a dynamic, right? Now, the child does not like feeling the helplessness of being completely dependent. Are they up? Are they down? Is dad in a good mood today? Or is he in a bad mood today? Now, of course, addiction, alcoholism and the like, exaggerates all this. I hope mom's not going to have too much to drink. If she has too much to drink, we're all pieces of shit, we're beaten, nothing we can do is right. If she doesn't have anything to drink, we're wonderful, whatever. Up and down, and it has nothing to do with us. Now, the adolescent takes this volatility that they feel humiliated by, because their most valuable thing, their well-being, is at the complete effect of their abuser. So the adolescent pulls themselves down and maintains a facade of a depressed, apathetic, fatalistic, miserable, bored person. Now, what's the abuser going to do with that? Nothing. How's your day? Nothing. Nothing? Yeah, nothing. You happy? What do you want to do? I'm bored. You have anything to say? No, I'm going to my room. The adolescent has created a shield that can mask all of the effect of their abuser. And in doing so, what happens is their abuser starts having to deal with their own feelings. Because before, dad said, I'm a I'm feeling miserable and I'm feeling helpless. Let me take someone and torment them until they feel miserable and helpless, and then they can carry my feeling and I can feel better about myself. That's what happened before. This nice, happy, playful person was taken all the way down into humiliated, helpless tears and then mocked, right? Because once you induce helpless tears in your child, you can then mock them. Oh, don't be such a sissy. So-and-so's a crybaby. Let's all throw pillows at the crybaby, right? Go on, cry, right? So now the crying is being dragged down into helplessness and rage. So then they want to attack, but look whose idiot's going to attack us. Let's all torment them until they understand that no matter what they do, it's futile, it's helpless, right? Then you have deep depression, self-hatred, and self-harm. And then you humiliate them for that, right? Well, then they just shut down in hate and in rage, in helplessness and in self-loathing. And nobody can move them at that point. At that point, they've reached a stable pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is rock bottom and miserable. And at that point, no amount of teasing is going to have any impact. And the abuser, the teaser, has to start dealing with their own feelings. Right? They also have to deal with their own shadow, their own cruelty, because if they've got even half a brain, they recognize that they have induced hell in the people around them, and that they're just stuck in that place. And it hasn't solved the original grief and the original unhappiness for the abuser. Right? So in this state, we can see that learned helplessness actively resists any effort to be happy. And if you look at Mo's book, it's filled with efforts, the seven, the 5, 6, and 7, the 6 blind spots, the 7 faulty whatever there were, and but there's effort. We'll get to that later. So you got to take effort. Someone in learned helplessness cannot get off the floor, let alone make those efforts. So that's important to understand. And they will resist the effort. They will absorb outside energy and stay stagnant, right? So on the surface, it looks like they don't want to be happy. In fact, they have learned that they will be happier doing nothing than learning to be happy. On the surface, the bully, the abuser, wants to be happy, but they have learned that they cannot be happy, and that the best happiness that they're going to experience is transferring their helplessness and loneliness to the person who was happy and bringing them down to where they can't get out of prison either. Crabs pulling each other back. And then the third is the deeply traumatized victim in the childlike state that could not leave the abusive relationship, be it a 40-year-old person in a dependent relationship with a spouse, be it male or female, cannot leave the abusive relationship, does not have the path or the skill or the model that would lead them to develop independent skills, but they can reduce the yo-yo function of their life of going up and down and being knocked down by their abuser by just physiologically holding their identity down at the low end of that continuum so that they can't be knocked down. And what this does is it produces a feeling of agency, a feeling of control that is preferable, that is happier for the ego, for the I, than, like you might look at it rationally and say, well, if I could be happy 50% of the time, and then my abuser would knock me down 50% of the time, and I couldn't be happy, but why wouldn't I just be happy half the time rather than none of the time? Because the feeling of control and the sense of safety and certainty that that provides is a deeper need for the ego, for the I, than the feeling of preference or joy. And you cannot have a sense of control and certainty if you are routinely knocked off of a state, any state, into another state that's its opposite, right? If you're a victim of a bullying dynamic and every time you walk in with your pile of books in school, every single fucking time you're happy and relaxing, you have your books, the bully just knocks your books off. And in a sociopathic cult, laughter, right? Cruelty. You have cruelty directed at the victim who couldn't stand up to the bully. This is your worst feeling. Alone, helpless, and cruelty. And there isn't a single person standing up to you because they're a coward. They're frightened of the bully. So you're now alone, helpless, humiliated, and you're surrounded by cowards. That state will induce hatred, hostility, statistically. Now, you can nurse hatred and hostility even when the bully isn't there, because you know they're coming, and you know the fucked up world is coming with its next batch. But you can't, in that state, as a child, find the kind of joy that Mo's talking about. So you can cultivate victim hate, self-pity, hostility. And you can hold that state day in and day out. I'm going to get them someday, those fucking bastards. That's a stable state. And what we see is that human beings who are induced into a stable state of hate, learned helplessness, rage, hostility, bitterness, revenge, self-loathing, and shame, do not leave that state until and unless from a position of power, meaning where they know how to get themselves out of that state and nobody can knock them off. And this is the rub. It is very difficult and statistically very rare for someone in a state of hate, hostility, rage, helplessness, humiliation, shame, and self-loathing to create the kind of environment where people treat them well, consistently, and where they would have the confidence to raise out of that state. So most teenagers will go through their entire teenage years in some version of that. Now, the parent may get all anxious and upset about this, and so sometimes then the teenager creates a veneer to please the parent so that the parent can continue being an absent parent and busy at work while not feeling so horrible about themselves as parents. So in other words, the parent will anxiously beg the teenager, please tell me it's okay so that I can continue ignoring you and going to work. And so the abused, helpless, suicidal teenager will put on a happy face for the parent so that the parent has permission to ignore their deepest trauma and suffering and loneliness. And then the parent will reward them and say, thank you, here's an ice cream cone, here's this, and then go and ignore them. Of course, the ice cream cone doesn't help in the slightest. And the child will understand that what the parent wants is for them to lie so that the parent can feel better. And the parent does not actually want to see them. In other words, the parent doesn't actually care. And the child, the adolescent, gains their sense of value from the parent. So I hope what you can see here is that most of us, most of the time, are actually attached to feeling miserable for one of those three reasons. And in that sense, one cannot expect out of naivete people to pursue the path of sustainable well-being. So let's see what Mo says next.
Happiness is that glorious feeling when everything seems right, when all of life's twists and turns and jagged edges seem to fit together perfectly. In those often all too brief flickers of genuine happiness, every thought in your head is agreeable.
I would call that more joy. And so this is one of my differences in Mo's model. I think that happiness is a fulfillment of our needs. Maslow outlines our needs to survive, to feel secure, to experience love and belonging, to develop self-esteem, to discover and develop our gifts, to bring those gifts abundantly into the world, like Mo's doing, and to be part of something bigger than ourselves, right? So that's happiness, when we fulfill our needs. It's not when everything is going absolutely perfectly. We can be happy in a world that is not going perfectly if we are fulfilling our needs. And our happiness comes as we move towards the fulfillment of our needs. I would say that joy comes when our preferences, when, oh, that's my favorite music, that's my favorite food and all that. Happiness, I don't have any food to eat. I've got some soup and some good bread, right? That's happiness, right? Joy is I've got, caramelized ice cream and, the pleasure and preferences. It's more about the ideal. But this also, just highlights the fact that words are just symbols for this territory.
And you wouldn't mind if time stood still and the present moment extended forever. Whatever we choose to do in life.
Now, one thing to highlight there is that the person who has repeatedly been knocked down when things are in a great place does not actually feel relaxed when everything is it's never perfect, but when everything is as close to perfect as it's ever been. The traumatized abuse survivor is terrified at that moment because it feels good and they're about to be crushed again based on body memory. And they're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so we do actually have something called a success crisis, where reality gets too big and too good, and it doesn't match the model in the body that the body has learned over time, the traumatized body. And so we're actually in a heightened state of desperation and anxiety. When's it going to fall? When's it going to be taken from me? It's too good. And then there will be great relief when we lose a bunch of money or the person leaves us, because now we're back to a comfort zone. So that's also important to understand in this territory.
Ultimately an attempt to find this feeling and make it last. Some people look for it in romance, while others seek it in wealth or fame, and still others through some form of accomplishment. Yet we all know of people who are deeply loved, achieve great things, travel the world, snap up all the toys money can buy, indulge in every luxury, and still long for the elusive goal of satisfaction, contentment, and peace, also known as happiness. Why should
I would differentiate in that territory around deep love. They are deeply loved. You cannot be deeply loved in a traumatized state, in a sociopathic state. And a sociopathic state just means there were so many painful, overwhelming things that have not gotten reintegrated and digested within the identity, including the body, that one can be, for example, in PTSD and complex PTSD, the outer world can feel and or can look like it's perfect, but it isn't. It isn't, because the body is part of the outer world, and the body is still in the memory of dissociation, is still in a state of trauma. And in that state, the only way you could say, oh, that woman is smiling at me, she's offering me some tea, she's very beautiful, she's happy to have sex with me, she's listening to what I have to say. But if I'm a traumatically illiterate person, as most of us are, and if I don't know how to lead her into my traumatic territory in my body to where I feel like a 5-year-old collapsed, terrified child that I can't stand to connect with, and I don't know how to love that part of me, well, she doesn't know how to love that part of me either. And in most cases, right, in all cases, you cannot love what you do not see. And you cannot love what you do not understand. And you cannot love what you do not empathize with. And you can't empathize with what you don't understand. And you can't understand what you cannot see. So we are living in a vast traumatic blind spot where most of us are in dissociated states in parts of our body from various points in our life, and are not seeing ourselves in that area because we're traumatically illiterate. And we do not see other people in that area because we're traumatically illiterate. And they do not see us because they're traumatically illiterate. And if they see the symptoms of the PTSD and trauma, they don't understand them. And if they understand them, they don't empathize with them. And if they empathize with them, they don't respond to them in the way that heals that trauma and PTSD, and neither do we. And so I would say that that is not love. You can say that someone is a very nice human being, that if one was not in a traumatized state, would be experienced as love. But when someone is in a deeply traumatized state, and the other person is being nice, but not acknowledging and responding and seeing and understanding the trauma, it's not actually love for the traumatized part of the self. And that's another thing. We'll see if Mo gets into this in later chapters, but the self is a series of parts. It's not all or nothing. And it's not one or the other. We're all part of a great ecology, and that ecology exists as a microcosm and all the inner personas on the inside. And it exists in a macrocosm in all the probability fields of humanity expressed in the family and culture around us.
Something so basic be so hard to find? The truth is, it isn't. We're just looking for it in the wrong places. We think of it as a destination to reach, when in fact, it's where we all began.
So I would say that the hardness, meaning he's saying it seems so, why is it so hard, and then it isn't hard. I wouldn't say it is hard or not hard, but I would say that, because it's not hard to become traumatically literate, but it does take time. It does take patience. And it is, I think, very difficult. In fact, I would say that one of the biggest blind spots in the whole territory is trauma and PTSD. I would say that it is a fool's journey to seek to heal one's own misery and suffering while remaining traumatically illiterate. It is doable because statistically, you'll find some that do get there. But it's not I would never recommend someone go to Vegas to get rich by betting. Right? Some do, but it's such a small percentage, it's not a friendly recommendation. But buying a house and living in it for 30 years and paying off a mortgage is a pretty good way to be, to become wealthy, relatively speaking. And so I would say that becoming traumatically literate is more like buying a house. Looking at the very small statistics that reach a transcendent state without becoming traumatically literate is more like going to Vegas. It's a crapshoot.
Have you ever searched for your keys only to realize they were in your pocket all along? Remember how you removed everything from your desk, searched beneath the couch, and got more and more frustrated the longer they went missing? We do the same thing when we struggle.
Now, this is, I think, a useful and a misleading analogy, because what Mo is saying is correct, that joy, that happiness is always available and it's within us. It's in our pocket. But in order to step out of, for example, the crystallized rage of the adolescent may need a friend, a presence to go back in time in the body to a level to be there with them and be with that frustration and loneliness where the happiness was banished because our happiness was being used as a vehicle to demonstrate power by sociopaths around us. I mean, when we were happy, that's when we were attacked. So yes, it's in our pocket, but it's in our pocket because a physiological part of us, an inner psychological part of us, knows with certainty that as soon as we become happy, people want to borrow money, they'll take us down, they'll laugh at us, they'll do all these things. Even if it's no longer true in the moment, the dialogue hasn't happened with that part, right? And so as we try and go for that part, we're trying to go towards death. We're trying to go towards shame and humiliation as we get it out of our pocket. And so that part will become our enemy unless we understand, empathize, and love that part of us enough to make new choices as partners. And so this is very, very key in this territory. And it's important to understand this because Mo has written a beautiful book with a beautiful intention, and yet less than 2% of Mo's readers are going to radically transform their lives into a transcendent joy. Less than 2%, less than 1%, or let's say it's around 1%. And it's important to understand that Mo's intention is not flawed. And it's important to understand that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the 99% of people that are going to get a little bit out of it and maybe do 5%. Mo talks in 10x thinking at Google X, right? And so the success to translate that competence into this arena would be that someone would be 10 times happier, that the average person, like the average person using a cell phone, which is a competent piece of technology, has 10 times more mobility and access to information than the person with a landline. And they're not very smart. I mean, we're not asking the average person to learn coding and be a genius to get 10 times more benefit from a cell phone. Now, the average person reading this book is going to get 5%, I would guess it would be in that territory, 5% happier over time because of the book. Now, that's not a 10x book. So we're dealing, now Mo is in 10x territory with this book. But Mo is applying skills that he learned to be 10x in Google to begin with, right? So it's a huge It's a huge challenge to deliver a technology that would deliver 10x happiness for the average person, for anyone who used it. And I don't think we're going to get there by little tricks that say that it's all in your pocket at the time without understanding why you put it there and why one part of you is holding it in your pocket for dear life.
To find happiness out there, when in fact, happiness is right where it's always been, inside us.
No, I would say well-being or joy is a natural state when we're not traumatized. If you statistically, because happiness is about fulfilling needs, and the needs are out there. Now, this is, I think, quite important, because try and be happy without breathing. I don't need oxygen. My happiness is inside. I'm going to cut myself off from what's out there. Not going to breathe. I'm not going to eat. I'm not going to drink. You're not going to be happy. Now, you could be joyful as you die in a transcendent state, freeing yourself from the body. The spirit is transcendent of the body. But the I, the ego, is not going to be happy if you don't fulfill its need to survive, to feel secure in that survival, to experience love and belonging in a relationship out there. Like when you write affirmations and feel better about yourself, that's out there. You're writing out there. When you think a thought, it's out there. So I think it's really useful to understand that we do need to fulfill our human needs. We do need to fulfill our human needs, and that the needs are out there. Oxygen, it's out there. Liquid, out there. Food, out there. Friendship, out there. Even when we are a friend of ourselves, like Mo points out accurately that there is a distinction between the voice in our head and the one witnessing the voice in our head. Now, Mo says that the voice in our head isn't us. I think that's a mistake. I think Mo would more accurately say that the voice in our head is one part of us, and the witness of the voice in our head is another part of us. Like, why is it an either or? Mo makes his hypothesis a little later in the book, saying that you can be silent for a while if your thoughts can stop, but you're still there. That means, he hypothesizes, that the voice in your head isn't you. The real you is the witness. But on what evidence? Right? Can you be you without a single thought? That would be another way of doing it. So you can say that there is a you that can witness the thoughts, but let's say you had zero thought and zero feelings about those thoughts, and thus you did zero things out of those thoughts, like it is a thought, I think I'll go eat something. Your identity, your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, which is that voice and that voice that's saying that's me, that identity, the I attaches itself to that pattern. Well, you've got is there a you there without any thought, feelings, sensations, awareness of them? You're not there either, right? But what if you say that it's both? I am the voice in my head, that's one part of me, and I am the witness, that is another part of me. And what if we actually expand that and say, I am part of my ecology? I am part of the world. And just like my finger needs blood from my heart, I need oxygen from trees. Right? Now, it's also important to understand that without out there people, without a cult that has a language and a dogma, every cult has its dogma, and then it also has some growing and dynamic evolving elements, but it also has rigid dogmas. One of them is language. This is the word for finger. Why? Why not call it binger? No, It's finger. That's it. No more of that binger stuff. That's a finger. Why? Because it's a dogma. We're establishing certainty, a common reference point. But I want to call it binger. No. We'll put you on detention. We'll shame you. We'll give you an A. We won't give you any money because you can't speak the language that we all agreed to speak. Why do we agree it? Why do we agree to speak it, right? The cult has dogmas, structures that just are that way. There's probably a better language out there, but we're not learning it because this is the cult's code. These are the cult's rules. You learn this language. This is a finger. It's not a binger. It's a finger. You say binger, you got it wrong. You do too many things wrong, you're unemployed, you have no friends in a cult like ours. You get it all right, you combine all the things in the right thing, then you get success. You get to be Google X, right? You code for the operating system, you get it right, you succeed. But what if you coded for an operating system that didn't exist, but it was better code? Right? You fail. You launch an app on an operating system that doesn't exist, and your app doesn't it doesn't touch people's lives. If you fail too often in too many ways, nobody wants to be around you. Nobody will meet your needs, right? Because we're in a highly sociopathic cult, meaning the reptilian brain combined with enlightened self-interest, which is not empathy, it's rationality, rational reptile. 60 to 70% of the cult is doing 60 to 70% of their actions 60 to 70% of the time as a rational reptile. And the rational reptile is focused on survival and security of survival. It's not focusing on love. A reptile, even a rational reptile, cannot love. They can do the things they think are loving because the mind can understand the idea of love, but they cannot love. So we're in that, we're in that territory, and we do need things on the outside. And we will be unhappy, our I, our ego, our body will be deeply unhappy if we starve it of oxygen, of liquid, of food, of affection, of love and belonging, of serenity and peace. If we put this body without any earphones in a chalkboard being scraped with no food, we do water torture, we rape your children, you can enter a transcendent state of joy if you've got a tremendous capacity to connect with the part of yourself that is the witness. But again, we're talking less than 1% of 1% of 1% of the population that can feel joy regardless of what's going on in the outer world, right? Because this creates a little bit of also, I think, a false dichotomy, right? Because we are a part of the outer world. We are linked inextricably throughout all time, throughout all space, throughout all species. We are linked to everything outside because what is us, the energy that is us, was present in the Big Bang. And this is just one of its possibilities. And the possibility field is mathematically linked, or it mathematically links every possibility. Meaning the field, if you imagine it like a web or a thread of possibility, it runs through every single possibility. Now, if you imagine a number chain as a number possibility thread, you take the infinite number train, you divide it into 10, Why? Why not divide it into 20, 30, 40? Let's just say you take all the number systems. You divide it into 5, a 5-base number system, then you repeat, you do it into 7, you do it into 8, you do it into 9. You create an infinite field of mathematical series, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, if you delete 13, you can't get to 14 without 13. Right? You could call it, we could call it 14 minus 1, but that's still holding a placeholder. You cannot have any part of the possibility field exist without the entirety of the possibility field existing. You can't have a single point in the space continuum with true void. You can have space, we call less dense subatomic particles and all that, but you can't have nothing. Everything is connected to every other thing in time and in space, and on the possibility field, and in the number system. Whichever way you see, it's all connected. Which means that we are outside, and outside is inside. We're just playing around with language. Now, that's more accurate, but it may not be more useful. In other words, what Mo's doing may be more useful than the truth, if it works.
A basic design feature of our species. Our default state. Look at your computer, smartphone, or other gadgets. They all come with the preferences preset by the designers and the programmers. There's a certain level of screen brightness, say.
So the idea that the default state is well-being or happiness, I would say is contextual. Like, there are people giving birth in wars, and their mother is excreting fear and adrenaline and cortisol in their body, and that's the food the fetus is getting, having nightmares, being traumatized, being beaten up. Well, in that environment, the consciousness is born into trauma and into horror, into terror. Generally speaking, we have a good enough cult, a good enough cultural framework that most people, most of the time, have a little bit of peace and well-being. But it's, we see a lot of tears, a lot of crying, a lot of trauma in children. And a lot of people that do the regression work into perinatal work, if you look at Stan Grof's work, for example, you'll find there's a tremendous amount of trauma and overwhelm and uncertainty in the birth process, to come through that little hole, etc. Now, most people dissociate from it, but it's still there as an anxiety. I could have been killed. There's this sense of the fragility of an identity living in the body. And so I don't think there is a default state for human beings to say that babies are automatically happy. I think that if the environment is non-traumatic and attunes to people's needs, there's a movement towards well-being, that there's an impetus to move towards that.
Or a localized user interface language. A device fresh from the factory, set up the way its creators think best, is said to be in its default state. For human beings, simply put, the default state is happiness. If you don't believe me, spend a little time with a human fresh from the factory, an infant or toddler. Obviously, there's a lot of crying and fussing associated with the startup phase of little humans, but the fact is, as long as their most basic needs are met, no immediate harm.
Yes, as long as their basic needs are met from the outside. There will be fussing. So the fact, it's not the fact, The fact is there will be a lot of crying, but that doesn't mean the default state is suffering. And the fact is that if their basic needs are truly met and attuned with, there will be a lot of joy. It's no different for us as adults, except for the three attachments: learned helplessness, the joy in pulling other people's down, the self-control of staying down, since one cannot stay up. It's easier to maintain a miserable, bored state than it is to maintain a joyful state. If you're in a joyful state, I love life, and you turn on the news and you're responding to nature, now you're responding to the worst elements in the world, it's very easy to come down. But if you're in a depressed and miserable state and you turn on a nature documentary and there's some joy, it's very easy to tune it out, right? And stay lost in your suffering. So it is easier to sustain a negative state. And this is why teenagers seeking control gravitate. In an abusive environment, gravitate. Now, absolutely, every human being, and if you, from birth to the present time, if your basic needs are securely met, your default state is happiness. But that isn't the default state of life, to basically meet the needs of all humans from birth to the present time. The basic state is a tremendous amount of ignorance, a tremendous amount of cruelty, a tremendous amount of trauma, and a tremendous dissociation from all that pain. Tremendous. If you look at history, and just look at how many people went through, that ideal state, it is not the fact. I think that the more you have an outer environment that is conducive to bring about joy and well-being, the more you have joy and well-being. And the more that you have an outer state that is conducive to trauma, the more you raise and have reptiles in human bodies with fight, flight, and freeze as their primary operating system. So I think a more accurate thing is simply that you can induce and you have a fresh slate, right? If you can isolate a mother in a nurturing, safe environment from all of the news and going to work and almost getting hit by a car and being angry when someone cut her off 3 or 4 times on the highway and all the chemicals that produce in the body. If you can take that mother out of that scenario and give her a hope of a future without that scenario and raise a child with people like that, you will get statistically, you will get a human being that reaches towards transcendence. And if you raise people in our cult, you get exactly what the statistics are in this cult. 70% of people, 70% of the time, do things in a rational reptilian framework. They mute their hostility because it's not in their interest to do so. They feel hurt, but they're going to be humiliated in a reptilian culture for talking about their hurt. It's not going to get them anything. They take subtle revenges and all of that. And they do it on their children, and their children grow up in that same mold. And not only that, but the default mechanism from a phone is just as sociopathic, right? I just got a switched cell phone carrier to Verizon, and just the act of putting in a new SIM card and connecting. Oh, I had all the advertising, all the addictive video games, all of the sponsor this, sponsor that. I had to disable, delete. It's the default mode is shit when you're in a sociopathic thing. Now, it's not shitty enough that you'd stop hiring them, but it's shit enough that you have to spend the first 30 or 40 minutes using your phone undoing the stuff that is not in your interest, but that will make more money for the cell carrier. And I think we're dealing in, that's just how rational reptiles behave. They know that I'm not going to go all the way back to my old carrier. I'll spend the 30, 40 minutes, and they know they'll get money. And they didn't tell me that they were going to do that, because if they did, I wouldn't have switched over. And so they hid that fact, right? That's rational reptile.
Hunger, no immediate fear, no scary isolation, no physical pain or enduring sleeplessness.
Oh, yeah. Write that. You give that to me or to the average person, no pain, no sleeplessness, no this, we'll all be very naturally happy. But where is that happening? Right? So that's the default mode in a more beautiful and perfect world. But where is that happening? Right? So we're not creating that beautiful world either for our children or for ourselves. But yes, if we could and do that consistently, that is the natural byproduct, joy and happiness. But that's what we're learning to do as a species. We are learning to have happiness, to have joy, to have fun. And I think it's important. Shame is the question, kind of what's wrong with me that I'm not fitting in. I think it's important not to shame the audience by pretending it's in your pocket and can come out easily. And if it doesn't, the question is, well, what's wrong with you, right?
They live in the moment, perfectly happy. Even in distressed parts of the world, you can see children with dirty faces using little pebbles as toys or holding a cracked plastic plate as the steering wheel of an imaginary sports car.
That, by the way, I think is an important distinction to clear up. We measure happiness and well-being as a culture by, do they have televisions? Do they have running? That's not actually it, right? Whether you have a sports car or a wooden thing or a pebble, that has nothing to do with how sociopathic, how traumatic, how safe the child feels. You can have and dirt is a totally fabricated cult phenomena. Don't be dirty, right? In fact, if we removed all the chemicals from our body and rubbed ourselves with dirt, we would be healthier. That is a chemical fact, right? So it's a cultural, we overlay cult on science and say, don't be dirty, spray all these chemicals and do this and that and the other and keep the ingredients of makeup secret from women so that they don't have to know which heavy metals they're rubbing onto their lips and all in the very porous level. So we do all, so yes, dirt is 100% better for people, as is an environment where you can play around the dirt and be loved and play with, rather than someone saying, he's dirty, don't play with him, right? So we have vastly confused cult dogmas in our own cult with happiness. A kid is way happier being accepted as they are and being able to be imaginative than they are going to be in a video game in a perfect world where they're going to get shouted at for spilling, Coke on the $3,000 sofa. That's not happiness. That's control and perfectionist trying to be good enough for, why are you so angry that your kid has spilt Coke on the $3,000 sofa, right? That was supposed to look cool and make me look good when friends come over, and you're ruining that. And my friends won't like me, because because I don't look cool. I have to look cool, right? So there's a huge gap between real felt joy and happiness, which can be with, playing in a tree, and being safe and knowing that you'll be welcome home and given a hug, to having a sports car and a cold sociopathic parent that judges you at every level as a reptile would.
They may live in a hovel, but as long as they have food and a modicum of safety, you'll see them run around hooting with joy. Even in news coverage of refugees.
They will actually run around and have more joy because they're running around, right? You'll have them be more happy because, again, we've misunderstood. Running around brings, a sense of health and vitality. Playing and imagining connects you with yourself. playing a video game in a dark room alone does the opposite. You'll find, similarly, you could just say, a majority of teenagers playing video games are not very happy, are a bit lonely, a bit dissociative, a bit depressed, but we've completely misunderstood what creates what.
Refugee camps where thousands have been displaced by war or natural disaster, the adults in front of the camera will appear grim. But in the background, you'll still hear the sounds of kids laughing as they play soccer with a knot of rags for a ball. But it's not only kids. This default state.
Yeah, and definitely children have a dissociative imaginative ability that helps them to survive and stay interested in life when the adult, a kid in Auschwitz can play with a pebble, can do this, can play hide and seek with a friend. It's harder for an adult that knows that their child is going to be burned alive in a few weeks to feel that. The child can be lost in the imagination. That, we could also do that. We could all pretend that, it's our landlord's going to love us if we don't pay the rent, but the adult is much more aware of the fragility of things in a sociopathic environment where the landlord is going to evict you at the very time that you need help the most. Because if you had the money, you wouldn't need the help. And so they won't evict you. But if you don't have money to pay medical bills, you're going to be evicted so that's not a very enjoyable thing to understand. My bank will not give me a loan at the very time I desperately need the loan to take care of my child. The bank will give a loan to a billionaire to gamble with because they don't need the money. But they won't give even $1,000 to save a child's life because you're a bad risk in a sociopathic paradigm. These things are painful to recognize, I think.
Applies to you too. Look back into your own experience. Summon up a time when nothing annoyed you, nothing worried you, and nothing upset you. You were happy, calm, and relaxed. The point is, you didn't need a reason to be happy. You didn't need a big promotion or a hot date or a yacht with a helicopter pad. All you needed was no reason to be unhappy, which is another way of saying happiness is the absence of unhappiness. Remember?
I think that's true. Happiness is the absence of unhappiness, and happiness is having one's needs met. Meaning, if you have no oxygen, your link to the outer world is cut off. Your dependency on trees has been severed. And so you're going to be unhappy, right? But that is, in other words, if we delete unhappiness, if we give people oxygen, food, safety, sleep, security that these things will be met, many, many, many people can go off even in a dissociative childlike fantasy and be okay, right? That's in many ways what people do with addictions, is they just block out all the things they know are coming that they feel helpless to do anything about, and they feel better. So, even here, I'm in a pretty neat and comfortable state, and if I don't take the time to understand how this is likely to affect, other people, I feel pretty great. And yet, I've also had many frustrating times with many models of well-being put out there, whether by authors or therapists. And so I think I'm more empathizing with past me, that being left with all these different models, many of which don't sit and sort, they don't fit together. If you read a bunch of books on happiness and stuff, you'll have different models and different definitions and different theories, but you still have a reality in which most people are unhappy most of the time. And so if it was that easy and everyone wants to be happy, then why aren't the statistics reflecting that, right? So I have some happiness in challenging and, putting these things up because it feels a little bit more sane, right? And sanity tends to have a better result than models that lack. I mean, you can think of it in a business like with low profit margins, like the auto industry. The auto industry will get like 6-7% net profit on their, billions invested. Well, if they built their model for investing billions and deleted 10% of the core costs to doing that, then they would actually be bankrupt. If you build a model of profitability, but you delete 10% of your expenses and you've only got 6% profit, you're actually, if you believe and follow the model with the missing data, you're going to fail, right? And most people are failing and shaming themselves for their failure. And they're being given models of happiness that delete core parts of the data, right? And so that's I have empathy for those people, having experienced that myself. And so this is a good way to engage with a book. Like I encourage you, when you read a book, to pause and think about things, because it's less passive. The child in each of us can unconditionally accept anyone. The adolescent can say it's all bullshit, right? But there's a place in the middle where we can say, okay, that could be useful, that could be useful. And I'm sure that Mo has useful things, so I'm looking forward to getting that. But even the best models that are put out in a largely psychologically illiterate culture are deeply, deeply flawed. There's whole dimensions of the human being and human experience that is just left out of all kinds of models. And it's frustrating to have, to witness people shaming themselves for the failure that produces. All right. And so anyway, we'll leave it for now, because in this model of this body, my butt's hurting on this chair. But anyway, perhaps we'll carry on later.